The voicemail came on a Tuesday evening, cold and matter-of-fact, like Jennifer was canceling a dentist appointment instead of uninviting her own sister from the most important day of her life. Elizabeth Clark stood in her small apartment kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, replaying the message for the third time, hoping she had somehow misunderstood. "Elizabeth, it's Jennifer. I've been thinking about the wedding guest list and honestly I think it would be better if you didn't come. The venue is smaller than we thought and we need to keep it intimate. Family only. Well, close family. You understand. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The line went dead. No explanation. No apology. Just the cruel efficiency that had defined Jennifer's treatment of her younger sister for as long as Elizabeth could remember. Elizabeth set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at the invitation that had arrived 3 months earlier, still magnet to her refrigerator. Elegant script on cream cardstock announcing Jennifer Richardson's wedding to Bradley Thompson. The same invitation that had made Elizabeth so happy she'd called Jennifer immediately to offer help with planning, only to be told everything was under control. Now she understood why Jennifer had been so distant during their brief phone calls. Why she'd deflected every question about bridesmaid dresses and rehearsal dinners. Why she'd seemed almost annoyed when Elizabeth mentioned she'd already bought a dress and booked time off work. This wasn't about venue space. This was about something deeper, something that had been festering between them for years. Elizabeth walked to her living room window and looked out at the city lights blurring through her tears. 28 years old, and she was still that little girl desperately trying to win her older sister's approval. Jennifer had always been the golden child, prettier, more popular, more successful in their parents' eyes. Elizabeth had accepted her role as the afterthought, the one who cleaned up Jennifer's messes and celebrated her victories from the sidelines. But this was different. This was cruel. Her phone buzzed with a text from their mother. "Jennifer told me about the wedding situation. I'm sure she has her reasons. Try to understand, sweetheart." Even their mother was taking Jennifer's side without question. Elizabeth felt the familiar sting of being the family scapegoat, the one expected to be understanding while Jennifer got to be selfish. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too full of memories of Jennifer's previous victories. The corner where Jennifer had announced her engagement during last year's Christmas dinner while Elizabeth was still recovering from her own breakup. The couch where Jennifer had detailed her elaborate wedding plans while Elizabeth nodded and smiled, hiding her own loneliness behind genuine happiness for her sister. Elizabeth grabbed her laptop and did something she'd never done before. She chose herself. Within an hour, she'd booked a flight to Costa Rica, leaving in 2 days. A week at a rainforest lodge, far from wedding drama and family obligations. Far from Jennifer's carefully orchestrated perfect life that somehow always required Elizabeth's exclusion to maintain its shine. Her credit card would hate her, but her heart needed this. For once, she wasn't going to be available to absorb Jennifer's casual cruelty or their family's enabling silence. As she packed, Elizabeth thought about all the times Jennifer had made her feel invisible. The birthday party where Jennifer had forgotten to invite Elizabeth's friends. The college graduation where Jennifer had monopolized their parents' attention with her own job news. The countless family gatherings where Jennifer's achievements were celebrated while Elizabeth's were footnotes. But this wedding band felt different. It felt final. Like Jennifer was officially writing her out of the family narrative, reducing her to an inconvenience to be managed rather than a sister to be cherished. Elizabeth's phone rang. Jennifer's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, Elizabeth hoped her sister was calling to apologize, to explain that the voicemail had been a mistake made in a moment of stress. But when she answered, Jennifer's voice was defensive and sharp. "Mom said you're upset about the wedding thing. Look, Elizabeth, this isn't personal. Bradley's family is huge and we have limited space. Someone had to be cut. I'm your sister, Jennifer. Your only sister. And you'll still be my sister after the wedding. One day doesn't change that. But it did change everything." Elizabeth realized with startling clarity that Jennifer saw her as disposable, someone who would always be there to absorb disappointment and offer forgiveness. Someone who would never fight back. "You're right," Elizabeth said quietly. "One day doesn't change anything. But it does reveal everything." She hung up before Jennifer could respond and turned off her phone. In 48 hours, she would be breathing rainforest air instead of wedding stress. She would be choosing her own happiness instead of waiting for permission to feel worthy of love. The voicemail had been meant to exclude her from Jennifer's perfect day. Instead, it had freed her to find her own. Elizabeth's hands shook as she transferred money from her savings account to checking, watching her carefully built emergency fund dwindle to pay for a spontaneous trip to Costa Rica. $3,000 for a week at the Monteverde Cloud Forest Lodge. Money she'd been saving for a car down payment. But sitting in her apartment at midnight, still reeling from Jennifer's casual dismissal, Elizabeth realized she'd been saving for the wrong kind of future. She'd been saving for a life that included Jennifer's approval, Jennifer's wedding, Jennifer's version of what family should look like. Maybe it was time to invest in a life that was entirely her own. The booking confirmation email arrived as she was making chamomile tea, hoping it would calm her racing thoughts. Your reservation is confirmed, Miss Clark. We look forward to welcoming you to paradise. Paradise. When was the last time Elizabeth had thought about paradise? When was the last time she'd thought about anything beyond managing Jennifer's moods and her parents' expectations? Her phone buzzed with another text from their mother. Jennifer's stressed about the wedding. You know how she gets. Maybe you could call her tomorrow? Elizabeth stared at the message, recognizing the familiar pattern. Jennifer acts badly, everyone else adjusts. Jennifer hurts people, everyone else heals quietly. Jennifer takes up space, everyone else shrinks to accommodate her. Instead of responding, Elizabeth opened her laptop and began researching Costa Rica. She read about ziplining through cloud forests, hiking to waterfalls, and spotting exotic birds. She watched videos of travelers describing life-changing experiences in nature, far from the complications of family drama. By 2 a.m., she planned an entire itinerary that had nothing to do with weddings or sisters or the exhausting work of being the family peacekeeper. For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt excited about something. She called in sick to work the next morning, not entirely a lie, since her heart felt genuinely broken, and spent the day shopping for hiking clothes and waterproof boots. At the outdoor gear store, the young salesperson asked about her trip with such genuine enthusiasm that Elizabeth found herself smiling for the first time since Jennifer's voicemail. Costa Rica is amazing, the girl said, helping Elizabeth try on rain jackets. My sister went there last year and said it changed her life. She was going through a rough breakup and came back like a completely different person. More confident, you know? Like she remembered who she was. Elizabeth nodded, understanding exactly what the girl meant. She'd forgotten who she was too, somewhere along the way of trying to be the sister Jennifer wanted, the daughter her parents expected, the person everyone needed her to be. Her phone rang as she was loading shopping bags into her car. Jennifer again. Elizabeth let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. Elizabeth, you're being ridiculous. I know you're upset, but don't you think you're overreacting? It's one day. One day where I want everything to be perfect. Can't you understand that? Call me back so we can talk about this like adults. The message made Elizabeth's chest tight with familiar anxiety. This was Jennifer's pattern: hurt someone, then make them responsible for fixing it. Make them feel childish for having feelings about being hurt. Make them do the emotional work of reconciliation while taking no responsibility for the original wound. But something had shifted in Elizabeth since the night before. Maybe it was the Costa Rica research, or maybe it was just exhaustion from years of this dance. But she found herself genuinely curious about what would happen if she simply didn't participate in Jennifer's drama this time. She drove to her best friend Riley's apartment instead of going home. Riley, a nurse who worked night shifts, was awake and making coffee in her scrubs. You look like hell, Riley said, pulling Elizabeth into a hug. What did Jennifer do now? Elizabeth told her about the wedding on invitation, the voicemail, the Costa Rica booking. Riley listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. She uninvited you from her wedding? Her own sister? She says it's about space. It's about control, Riley said flatly. Jennifer's always been threatened by you. You're kinder than she is, more genuine. People actually like you, not just your accomplishments. Elizabeth had never thought about it that way. She'd always assumed Jennifer's coldness came from disappointment in having such an unremarkable sister. But what if it came from something else entirely? Remember high school? Riley continued. When you were dating Chris Murphy and Jennifer suddenly became best friends with him. And then convinced you he was cheating so you'd break up with him? Elizabeth did remember. Jennifer had been so concerned, so protective, showing Elizabeth screenshots of Chris talking to other girls. Elizabeth had confronted him, they'd fought, and they'd broken up. A week later, Jennifer was dating him. She said she was protecting me, Elizabeth said quietly. She was protecting herself. From competition. Riley poured coffee into 2 mugs. And now she's marrying Bradley Thompson. Bradley who asked you out first, remember? Before Jennifer even knew him? The memory hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Bradley had approached her at their mutual friend's party 6 months ago, asking for her number. She'd been flattered but busy with work, and by the time she'd worked up the courage to text him, he was already dating Jennifer. Elizabeth had assumed he'd lost interest, but what if Jennifer had interfered again? You don't think she would? I think Jennifer saw Bradley's interest in you as a threat to her perfect life plan, Riley said. And I think this wedding ban is her way of making sure you don't remind anyone that her perfect husband was interested in her imperfect sister first. Elizabeth sat in silence, processing this new perspective. If Riley was right, then Jennifer's cruelty wasn't about wedding space or family drama. It was about fear. Fear that people might prefer Elizabeth's quiet kindness to Jennifer's polished perfection. So what are you going to do? Riley asked. Elizabeth thought about the booking confirmation email, about the hiking boots in her car, about the voicemail from Jennifer demanding she call back and apologize for being hurt. I'm going to Costa Rica, she said. And I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be the sister Jennifer wants. Riley smiled. Now that sounds like the Elizabeth I remember from college. The one who backpacked through Europe alone and came back glowing. Elizabeth had forgotten about that trip, about the confidence she'd felt exploring new places without anyone's approval or input. When had she stopped being that person? When had she started needing Jennifer's permission to take up space in her own life? What if the wedding falls apart while I'm gone? Elizabeth asked. Then it falls apart, Riley said simply. That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself. As Elizabeth drove home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for her own life. Not anticipation for Jennifer's approval or her parents' pride, but genuine excitement about what she might discover about herself in the rainforest. She would leave for Costa Rica in 24 hours. And for the first time in her adult life, she wouldn't be available to clean up Jennifer's messes or absorb her family's dysfunction. She was going to be busy being happy. The plane lifted off from Denver International Airport at 6 a.m., carrying Elizabeth away from wedding stress and towards something she couldn't quite name yet. She pressed her face to the window, watching the city shrink below, and felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen for the first time in weeks. During the layover in Miami, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with messages she didn't read. She could see Jennifer's name, her mother's, even her father's. The family crisis management team was mobilizing, probably trying to talk sense into her for having feelings about being excluded from her own sister's wedding. Instead of reading the messages, Elizabeth bought a book about Costa Rican wildlife and a journal with a bright green cover. She was going to document this trip, this first act of choosing herself over family obligation. The flight to San Jose took 3 hours, and Elizabeth spent them reading about scarlet macaws and poison dart frogs instead of wedding planning blogs. She felt like she was shedding an old skin somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, leaving behind the version of herself that apologized for existing. At the San Jose airport, Elizabeth met her shuttle driver Carlos, a cheerful man in his 50s who seemed genuinely excited about her rainforest adventure. During the 2-hour drive to Monteverde, he told her about his family, his love for the cloud forest, and his philosophy that sometimes people needed to get lost in nature to find themselves. You look like someone who needs finding, he said kindly as they wound through mountain roads. Elizabeth surprised herself by laughing. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who has been lost before. The forest has a way of showing you who you really are when no one else is watching. The Monteverde Cloud Forest Lodge exceeded every expectation Elizabeth had built from website photos. Perched on a hillside overlooking endless green canopy, the rustic building seemed to grow from the forest itself. Her room was simple but comfortable, with a private balcony that looked out over mist-shrouded trees. For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt like she could breathe deeply. She unpacked slowly, hanging her new hiking clothes in the small closet and placing her journal on the bedside table. Through the open window, she could hear sounds she'd never experienced before: exotic bird calls, rustling leaves, and the distant crash of a waterfall. At dinner, Elizabeth sat alone at a table for two, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel awkward about it. The other guests were friendly: a retired couple from Germany, a group of biology students from Canada, and a quiet man about her age who nodded politely when their eyes met. The food was simple and fresh: rice and beans, grilled fish, tropical fruits she'd never tasted. Elizabeth ate slowly, savoring each bite and the unusual luxury of eating without conversation or family tension. After dinner, she walked to the lodge's observation deck and looked out over the forest. The sun was setting, painting the clouds pink and gold, and the air smelled like rain and flowers. She pulled out her phone to take a photo and noticed 17 missed calls. Instead of checking them, she turned the phone to airplane mode and slipped it back into her pocket. Whatever wedding emergency Jennifer was orchestrating could wait. For the first time in years, Elizabeth was unavailable for family drama. That night, she fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof and nocturnal animals calling to each other in the darkness. She slept deeper than she had in months, without dreams of wedding dresses or family disappointment. She woke at dawn to find her balcony surrounded by clouds, the forest invisible in the morning mist. But as she sat with coffee and watched, the clouds began to lift, revealing the incredible diversity of green that gave the cloud forest its name. A bright red bird landed on her balcony railing, a scarlet tanager, according to her wildlife book. It looked at her with bright black eyes, tilted its head, and flew away. Elizabeth took it as a good sign. Her first organized activity was a guided nature walk with Miguel, a local naturalist who knew every plant and animal in the forest. The group was small, just Elizabeth, the German couple, and the quiet man from dinner, who introduced himself as Jake. Miguel led them through misty trails, pointing out orchids, bromeliads, and tiny frogs hiding in the vegetation. He explained how the cloud forest ecosystem worked, how every plant and animal depended on each other in an intricate web of relationships. "Nothing survives alone here," Miguel said, kneeling to show them a delicate flowering vine. "But nothing is required to sacrifice itself for others either. Each species takes what it needs and gives what it can. Balance." Elizabeth thought about her family, where she was always giving what she couldn't spare and never taking what she needed. Maybe that wasn't balance. Maybe that was just dysfunction disguised as love. During a rest stop at a viewpoint overlooking the valley, Jake approached her with a shy smile. "First time in Costa Rica?" he asked. "First time anywhere alone," Elizabeth admitted. "I'm Elizabeth, by the way." "Jake. I'm a photographer, mostly wildlife. This is my third time here, but I never get tired of it." He gestured toward the forest stretching endlessly in all directions. "There's something about being in a place this alive that makes you feel more alive too." Elizabeth understood exactly what he meant. After just one day, she felt more present in her own life than she had in months. "What brought you here?" Jake asked. "If you don't mind me asking." Elizabeth considered the question. She could tell him about Jennifer, about the wedding, about the years of feeling invisible in her own family. But that story belonged to the Elizabeth she'd left at the airport. This Elizabeth was here for herself, not because of anyone else's actions. "I needed to remember who I am," she said simply. Jake nodded like that made perfect sense. "I come here for the same reason. Something about the forest strips away all the noise and shows you what's actually important." They walked back to the lodge together, and Elizabeth found herself enjoying Jake's easy conversation about photography and travel. He didn't ask probing questions or offer unsolicited advice. He just seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about the forest, the wildlife, the experience of being somewhere completely new. That evening, Elizabeth finally turned on her phone to check for actual emergencies. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages, and 12 voicemails. She scrolled through them quickly, looking for anything that might indicate a real crisis. Instead, she found variations of the same message: "Call Jennifer back. Don't be stubborn. She's your sister. You're being selfish. This is her wedding. No one was dying. No one was injured. The only emergency was Jennifer's hurt feelings about Elizabeth not being available to be hurt." Elizabeth deleted the messages without reading them fully and set her phone aside. She opened her journal and began to write. Day 1 in paradise. "I woke up this morning and for the first time in months, I didn't immediately think about Jennifer's wedding. I thought about whether I wanted coffee or tea. I thought about what birds I might see today. I thought about myself, and it felt good instead of selfish. Maybe that's what I needed to remember. That thinking about myself isn't selfish. It's survival." Outside her window, the forest was coming alive with night sounds. Elizabeth felt herself becoming part of something larger and more peaceful than family drama. She was exactly where she needed to be. Elizabeth's second day in Costa Rica began with a revelation. She could choose what to do with her time. At home, her days were structured around work deadlines, family obligations, and Jennifer's rotating crises. Here, she could spend an entire morning watching hummingbirds at the lodge's feeder if she wanted to. And she did want to. She sat on her balcony with coffee and her wildlife book, identifying different species as they zipped between the bright red flowers. Ruby-throated hummingbirds, violet saber wings, and one tiny bee hummingbird that seemed to glow green in the early morning light. Jake found her there around 9, camera in hand and a shy smile on his face. "Mind if I join you? The light is perfect for bird photography right now." Elizabeth gestured to the empty chair beside her. I've been watching them for an hour. I never knew hummingbirds could be so different from each other. Most people don't take time to really look, Jake said, adjusting his camera settings. They're too busy rushing to the next thing. But you miss the magic when you're always moving. Elizabeth thought about her life at home, always rushing from work to family dinner to crisis management for Jennifer. When was the last time she'd sat still long enough to notice anything beautiful? They spent the morning in comfortable silence, Elizabeth reading and Jake photographing. Occasionally he'd point out a particularly striking bird or share a story about his wildlife photography adventures. His voice was calm and unhurried like the forest itself. I'm heading to the Hanging Bridges Trail this afternoon, Jake said during a break in the bird activity. Want to come along? It's supposed to be spectacular. Elizabeth's automatic response was to worry about imposing, about whether she was interesting enough company, about whether Jake was just being polite. But those thoughts belonged to the Elizabeth who lived in Jennifer's shadow. This Elizabeth was learning to accept kindness without questioning it. I'd love to, she said. The Hanging Bridges Trail was a series of suspension bridges connecting treetops high above the forest floor. Elizabeth had never been afraid of heights, but walking across a swaying bridge 70 feet above the ground while surrounded by infinite green was both terrifying and exhilarating. Jake walked ahead, occasionally stopping to photograph orchids or butterflies. Elizabeth followed, marveling at how different the forest looked from above. She could see the layers Miguel had described, the canopy, the understory, the forest floor far below where different communities of plants and animals lived. It's like a whole different world up here, she said, pausing in the middle of a bridge to look around. That's because it is, Jake replied, turning to face her. The canopy has its own ecosystem. Some animals spend their entire lives up here and never touch the ground. Elizabeth envied those animals. She'd spent her entire life on the ground, weighed down by family expectations and Jennifer's needs. What would it feel like to live in the canopy, free and light and untouchable? On the third bridge, Jake stopped abruptly and gestured for Elizabeth to be quiet. Ahead of them, a three-toed sloth hung from a branch, moving so slowly it seemed like a living statue. Jake photographed it while Elizabeth watched, fascinated by the creature's unhurried approach to life. He's got the right idea, Jake said softly. No rush, no stress. Just existing peacefully. Elizabeth's phone buzzed in her backpack. She turned it back on that morning, telling herself she needed to check for real emergencies. But the constant buzzing had become background noise, like the forest sounds she was learning to ignore. Everything okay? Jake asked, noticing her distraction. Just family stuff, Elizabeth said. Nothing urgent. But as they walked back to the lodge, Elizabeth's phone buzzed so frequently she finally pulled it out to check. The messages were becoming more frantic. Jennifer, Elizabeth, this is ridiculous. Call me back right now. Mom, your sister is crying. Whatever this is about, just talk to her. Dad, Elizabeth, honey, Jennifer says you're not coming to the wedding. Surely there's been a misunderstanding. Jennifer, I can't believe you're doing this to me. Today of all days. Elizabeth stopped walking. What's today? Jake looked at her with concern. Thursday. Why? Thursday. The final dress fitting. The day Jennifer had been planning for months, the day she'd insisted everyone's schedules revolve around. Elizabeth was supposed to be there, not as a bridesmaid but as emotional support, helping Jennifer manage her stress about whether the dress fit properly. A month ago, Elizabeth would have been on the first flight home. She would have apologized for being hurt, minimized her own feelings, and rushed to Jennifer's side to provide comfort for the situation Jennifer had created. But standing in the middle of a cloud forest, surrounded by trees that had been growing for centuries without anyone's permission or approval, Elizabeth felt something she'd never experienced before, the freedom to choose her own response. I need to make a call, she told Jake, but not the one everyone expects. She walked to a quiet spot on the lodge's deck and called Riley. Oh my God, Elizabeth, where are you? Jennifer's been calling everyone trying to find you. She's completely losing it about the dress fitting. I'm in Costa Rica, Elizabeth said, and I'm not coming back for the dress fitting. Good for you, Riley said immediately. How are you feeling? Free, Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the honesty. For the first time in years, I feel completely free. Jennifer's telling everyone you're having a breakdown. Maybe I am, Elizabeth said, watching a toucan land on a nearby branch. Maybe I'm having a breakdown of all the ways I've been making myself smaller to make everyone else comfortable. Riley laughed. That's not a breakdown, that's a breakthrough. Stay in Costa Rica. Let Jennifer handle her own dress fitting. After they hung up, Elizabeth sat on the deck for a long time, watching the forest and thinking about freedom. She'd always thought freedom meant having permission to do what she wanted. But maybe freedom meant not needing permission at all. That evening, she joined Jake for dinner again. They talked about photography, travel, and the strange healing power of being somewhere completely unknown. Jake told her about his work documenting endangered species, about the urgency of capturing beauty before it disappeared. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you do when you're not escaping to rainforests?" Elizabeth almost said she was an accountant, her standard response that usually ended conversations. But she heard herself say something different. "I'm figuring that out." Jake nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable career. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when you stop looking for specific answers. Later, back in her room, Elizabeth opened her journal and wrote, Day 2. I missed Jennifer's dress fitting and the world didn't end. I spent the day walking through treetops and talking to someone who doesn't need me to be smaller to make room for his ego. I'm starting to understand the difference between being needed and being valued. Jennifer needs me to absorb her stress and validate her choices. Jake values my thoughts and enjoys my company. Maybe that's what I've been missing. The difference between being useful and being appreciated. Outside her window, the forest was settling into its nighttime rhythm. Elizabeth felt herself settling too, into a version of herself she was just beginning to meet. A version that didn't automatically apologize for taking up space. She fell asleep to the sound of night birds calling to each other, and for the first time in months she didn't dream about weddings. On her third morning in Costa Rica, Elizabeth woke to find her phone had died during the night. Instead of immediately charging it, she left it on the nightstand and walked to the observation deck with her coffee. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, misty and alive with bird songs she was beginning to recognize. She was learning to tell the difference between the harsh call of a toucan and the melodic trill of a clay-colored robin. She was learning that mornings in the cloud forest were best experienced without the intrusion of outside voices demanding her attention. At breakfast, Jake waved her over to his table. "Want to try zip-lining today? There's a canopy tour that starts at 10. Elizabeth's stomach fluttered with excitement and fear. The old Elizabeth would have declined, worried about looking foolish or getting hurt. But the new Elizabeth, the one who was learning to say yes to experiences instead of obligations, nodded eagerly. "I've never done anything like that before." "Perfect," Jake said. "The best adventures are the ones you've never tried." They spent the morning flying through the treetops on steel cables, Elizabeth screaming with delight as she soared above the forest floor. The guides, two young Costa Rican men named Luis and Carlos, were patient and encouraging as Elizabeth learned to trust the equipment and her own courage. "You're a natural," Luis said as Elizabeth landed smoothly on the final platform. "Most people are too scared to enjoy it the first time." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride. She was brave. She'd forgotten that about herself somewhere along the way of managing Jennifer's crises and her family's expectations. After lunch, she finally charged her phone and found 43 new messages. Instead of reading them all, she scrolled through looking for keywords that might indicate actual emergencies. Hospital, accident, death. Finding none, she called Riley. "Thank God," Riley said immediately. "I've been fielding calls from your family all morning. Jennifer's in full meltdown mode." "What's wrong now?" "The caterer had a kitchen fire. They can't do the wedding." Elizabeth felt a familiar pang of anxiety, Jennifer's problems becoming her emergency. But sitting in a hammock overlooking the cloud forest, she found she could observe the feeling without being consumed by it. "That's terrible," she said. "I'm sure she'll find another caterer." "Elizabeth, the wedding is in 4 days. Every decent caterer is booked. Jennifer's talking about canceling everything." A month ago, this news would have sent Elizabeth into crisis mode. She would have spent hours researching backup caterers, calling venues, and generally taking on the emotional labor of fixing Jennifer's emergency. But now she found herself curious about what would happen if she simply didn't. "That sounds really stressful for Jennifer," she said. "I hope she figures it out. Are you okay? You sound different." "I feel different," Elizabeth said, watching a family of monkeys swing through the trees below. "I feel like myself for the first time in years." That evening, Jake invited her to join him for a night hike to look for nocturnal wildlife. Elizabeth had never been in a forest at night, and she discovered it was an entirely different world. Creatures that hid during the day emerged to hunt and forage: owls, bats, and insects that glowed in the darkness. "It's like there are two forests," she said, following Jake's flashlight beam. "The day version and the night version." "Most places are like that," Jake said. Most people too. There's the version everyone sees and the version that comes out when no one's watching. Elizabeth thought about her own two versions. The accommodating sister who absorbed everyone's stress and the woman who was learning to zip line through rainforests. She was beginning to prefer the night version. They found a glass frog on a leaf, its translucent skin revealing tiny organs inside. Jake photographed it while Elizabeth watched, amazed by the creature's delicate beauty. "It's so vulnerable," she said. "You can see everything inside it." "But it's exactly as it should be," Jake replied. "It doesn't try to be opaque like other frogs. It's beautiful because it's honest." Back at the lodge, Elizabeth sat on her balcony and called her parents. Her mother answered on the first ring. "Elizabeth, thank goodness. Jennifer's been trying to reach you for days. The wedding is falling apart." "I heard about the caterer," Elizabeth said. "I'm sure Jennifer will find a solution. She needs you to come home. She's completely overwhelmed." Elizabeth looked out at the forest, where thousands of species lived and died and solved their own problems without requiring their siblings to drop everything and rush to their aid. "I'm not coming home early, Mom. Jennifer's wedding problems aren't my responsibility. She's your sister." "Yes, and she uninvited me from her wedding. Remember?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "She was just stressed. You know how she gets." "I do know how she gets. And I know how I get in response. I make myself smaller and smaller until I disappear entirely. I'm not doing that anymore." "Elizabeth, honey, this isn't like you." "Maybe that's the problem," Elizabeth said gently. "Maybe I've been so busy being what everyone needed that I forgot to be myself." After she hung up, Elizabeth opened her journal and wrote, "Day 3. Jennifer's wedding is falling apart and I'm not rushing to fix it. I spent the day flying through trees and walking through darkness, discovering parts of myself I didn't know existed. I'm starting to understand that my job isn't to absorb everyone else's chaos. My job is to live my own life." She fell asleep to the sound of nocturnal animals calling to each other, and dreamed of flying. Elizabeth's fourth morning in Costa Rica dawned gray and misty, the clouds so thick she couldn't see the forest from her balcony. But instead of feeling disappointed, she found the otherworldly atmosphere peaceful. She was learning to appreciate beauty in all its forms, even the obscured kind. At breakfast, Jake looked concerned. "The weather's supposed to clear by afternoon, but the morning hikes are canceled. Want to spend some time in the lodge's library? They have an amazing collection of books about local ecology." Elizabeth nodded, surprised by how comfortable she'd become with Jake's company. He didn't fill every silence with chatter or ask probing questions about her life. He simply existed peacefully beside her, like the forest itself. They spent the morning reading in leather armchairs by the library's large windows, occasionally sharing interesting facts about rainforest conservation. Elizabeth felt a contentment she'd never experienced before, the simple pleasure of learning something new without any pressure to be productive or useful to anyone else. Around noon, her phone rang. Jennifer's name flashed on the screen. Elizabeth stared at it for a moment, then declined the call. She was learning to distinguish between genuine emergencies and Jennifer's manufactured crises. If her sister was truly in trouble, she would call their parents or find another solution. Elizabeth was not the family's crisis management department. The phone rang again immediately. This time it was her father. "Elizabeth, you need to call your sister. She's in my office crying." Elizabeth's father was a patient man who rarely got involved in his daughter's conflicts. If Jennifer had dragged him into the drama, things must be escalating. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The wedding venue canceled. Something about a double booking." Jennifer's beside herself. Elizabeth felt a familiar tug of responsibility, the old instinct to drop everything and rush to Jennifer's aid. But she also felt something new, a curious detachment, as if she were observing the family drama from a great distance. "That's terrible," she said. "I'm sure she'll find another venue." "Elizabeth, the wedding is in 3 days. There are no other venues available on such short notice." "Then maybe she should postpone," Elizabeth said simply. Her father was quiet for a moment. "You really aren't coming home." "I'm exactly where I need to be, Dad." After they hung up, Elizabeth sat in the library thinking about patterns. Jennifer created chaos, the family mobilized to fix it, and Elizabeth sacrificed her own needs to make everything smooth again. But what would happen if she simply stepped out of the pattern? Jake looked up from his book. "Everything okay?" "My sister's wedding is falling apart," Elizabeth said. "Caterer canceled, now the venue. Part of me feels guilty for not rushing home to help." "And the other part?" Elizabeth considered the question. The other part is curious about what happens when I choose myself for once. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's dysfunction. That afternoon, the clouds lifted and they went for a hike to a hidden waterfall. The trail was challenging, requiring them to navigate slippery rocks and thick vegetation. Elizabeth found herself laughing as she struggled through particularly difficult sections, delighted by her own determination. At the waterfall, they sat on smooth stones and watched the water cascade into a clear pool below. Jake took photos while Elizabeth simply existed in the moment, feeling the mist on her face and the sun on her shoulders. I could stay here forever, she said. What's stopping you? Elizabeth started to list the reasons: work, family, responsibilities, but realized most of them were other people's expectations rather than her own desires. I don't know anymore, she admitted. That evening, Riley called with an update. Jennifer's completely lost it. She's calling everyone she knows, trying to find a venue. She even called your high school friends asking if they knew anyone in the wedding business. Did she find anything? Nothing suitable. She's talking about having the ceremony in your parents' backyard, but the reception was supposed to be for 200 people. Elizabeth tried to imagine elegant Jennifer agreeing to a backyard wedding and couldn't. Jennifer's image was everything to her. The perfect dress, the perfect venue, the perfect photographs for social media. What's Bradley saying about all this? That's the interesting part, Riley said. According to mutual friends, he's been remarkably calm about the whole thing. Almost like he's not that invested in the wedding happening. Elizabeth felt a strange chill. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the groom is having second thoughts about marrying someone who completely falls apart when things don't go perfectly. After they hung up, Elizabeth sat on her balcony thinking about Jennifer and Bradley. She'd always assumed Bradley was as invested in the perfect wedding as Jennifer was, but what if he wasn't? What if he was seeing a side of Jennifer that Elizabeth had been protecting him from? She thought about all the times she'd smoothed over Jennifer's meltdowns, made excuses for her sister's behavior, and generally presented Jennifer as more reasonable than she actually was. Had she been enabling Jennifer's worst impulses while protecting her from their consequences? Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Jennifer's talking about canceling the wedding entirely. She says if it can't be perfect, she doesn't want it at all. Can you please call her? Elizabeth stared at the message for a long time. The old Elizabeth would have called immediately, would have spent hours convincing Jennifer that love was more important than perfect logistics. But the new Elizabeth wondered if Jennifer's willingness to cancel her own wedding rather than accept imperfection said something important about her readiness for marriage. Instead of calling Jennifer, Elizabeth opened her journal and wrote, Day 4. Jennifer's perfect wedding is crumbling because perfection is fragile. I'm learning that real life is messy and beautiful and imperfect, like this forest where everything grows wild and free. Maybe the wedding falling apart isn't a crisis that needs fixing. Maybe it's information that needs acknowledging. She fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof, and dreamed of waterfalls washing everything clean. Elizabeth's fifth morning in Costa Rica brought unexpected sunshine and an unwelcome phone call. She was sitting on her balcony, journaling about the previous day's waterfall hike, when her phone rang with an unknown number. Elizabeth? It's Bradley. Jennifer's fiancé had never called her directly before. Elizabeth felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Hi Bradley. Is everything okay? That depends on your definition of okay, he said with a bitter laugh. Can we talk? I mean really talk. Elizabeth glanced toward the lodge where Jake was probably having breakfast. She'd been looking forward to their planned birdwatching expedition, but something in Bradley's voice made her stay on the line. What's going on? Jennifer doesn't know I have your number. I got it from your friend Riley. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know it before I make a decision about this wedding. Elizabeth's heart started beating faster. What kind of decision? The kind where I'm wondering if I'm marrying the right person, or if I should be marrying anyone at all. Bradley's voice was strained, like he'd been awake all night. Elizabeth had never heard him sound anything but cheerful and confident. Bradley, if you're having doubts about the wedding, you should talk to Jennifer, not me. I tried. But Jennifer doesn't want to hear anything that doesn't fit her perfect narrative. She's convinced that if we can just find a new venue and fix the catering situation, everything will be fine. She won't acknowledge that maybe the universe is trying to tell us something. Elizabeth found herself in the strange position of defending her sister. Wedding planning is stressful. Jennifer's probably just overwhelmed. It's not about the wedding planning, Bradley said quietly. It's about what I learned when everything started falling apart. About why you're really not coming to the wedding. Elizabeth felt cold despite the warm morning air. What do you mean? Jennifer told me you were being selfish and dramatic. That you were jealous of her happiness and trying to ruin her wedding by refusing to come. But Riley told me the truth yesterday. Jennifer uninvited you, didn't she? Elizabeth closed her eyes. She'd hoped this conversation would never happen. Bradley, that's between Jennifer and me. Don't let our family drama affect your relationship. But it does affect my relationship. Because it tells me something about the person I'm supposed to marry. The person who would exclude her own sister from the most important day of her life. There was a long pause. Elizabeth could hear birds calling in the forest, life continuing peacefully while human drama played out across phone lines. There's something else, Bradley continued. Riley told me that Jennifer knew I was interested in you first. Before I even met her. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Bradley, that was months ago. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. Because I've been trying to figure out why Jennifer seemed so eager to date me right after I asked you out. I thought it was coincidence, but now I'm wondering if it was strategy. Elizabeth thought about Riley's theory about Jennifer's pattern of competing with her. She'd hoped Riley was wrong, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. What did Jennifer tell you about that? She said you weren't interested in me. That you were seeing someone else and she was doing me a favor by accepting my invitation to coffee. Elizabeth remembered that time period clearly. She hadn't been seeing anyone else. She'd been working late, trying to finish a big project, and had planned to text Bradley back as soon as she had breathing room. By the time she'd finished the project 2 weeks later, Jennifer and Bradley were already dating. I wasn't seeing anyone else, Elizabeth said quietly. I know. Riley told me about your work project. She said you were planning to text me back, but Jennifer convinced you I'd moved on. The pieces clicked together in Elizabeth's mind. Jennifer had seen Bradley's interest in Elizabeth as a threat and had moved quickly to eliminate the competition. Then she'd convinced Elizabeth that Bradley wasn't really interested, ensuring that Elizabeth wouldn't interfere with Jennifer's new relationship. Bradley, I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth. Are you the reason Jennifer uninvited you from the wedding? Because she was afraid of what people might think if they saw us together. Elizabeth looked out at the forest, where creatures lived and died according to honest instincts, not elaborate deceptions. I think Jennifer sees me as competition for everything, she said finally. Jobs, men, our parents' attention. I think she's been competing with me our whole lives, and I've been too busy trying to be a good sister to notice. Jesus, Bradley said. So she's marrying me to win a competition with you? I don't know why Jennifer's marrying you. But I know it's not my job to figure it out for her. After they hung up, Elizabeth sat in stunned silence. She'd always known Jennifer was competitive, but she'd never realized how calculated her sister's actions had been. The pattern was clear now. Jennifer identified what Elizabeth wanted and systematically took it away. Jake found her on the balcony an hour later, still processing the conversation. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said gently. I think I have. The ghost of my old life, where I let other people use me as a supporting character in their stories. She told him about Bradley's call, about Jennifer's manipulations, about the years of feeling like she was somehow failing as a sister when she was actually being sabotaged. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What are you going to do? Nothing, Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'm going to do absolutely nothing. Jennifer made her choices, Bradley needs to make his, and I'm going to continue choosing myself. Even if the wedding gets canceled? Especially if the wedding gets canceled. Maybe that's the natural consequence of building a relationship on manipulation and competition instead of love. That afternoon, they took a guided tour of a butterfly sanctuary. Elizabeth watched hundreds of colorful butterflies flutter around the enclosed garden, each one following its own path without regard for the other's destinations. They're not competing, she said to Jake. They're just being butterflies. Maybe that's what healthy relationships look like, Jake replied. Everyone just being themselves without trying to control or diminish anyone else. That evening, Elizabeth's phone rang constantly. Jennifer, her parents, even some of her extended family members had apparently been recruited to convince her to come home. Elizabeth listened to a few voicemails, all variations on the same theme. Jennifer needed her, the family was worried she was being selfish. Instead of feeling guilty, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of freedom. She was learning to distinguish between helping and enabling, between being needed and being used. She opened her journal and wrote, Day 5. The truth about Jennifer and Bradley surfaced today, and I realized I've been playing a role in someone else's story instead of living my own. Jennifer's wedding is falling apart because it was built on lies and manipulation. That's not my fault and it's not my responsibility to fix. I'm learning that the most loving thing I can do is refuse to participate in dysfunction, even when everyone else calls it family loyalty. Outside her window, the forest was alive with night sounds, creatures living honestly in the darkness, following their instincts without apology. Elizabeth was learning to do the same. Elizabeth woke on her sixth morning in Costa Rica to a phone that had been buzzing nonstop since dawn. Instead of checking it immediately, she made coffee and sat on her balcony, watching the sunrise paint the forest in shades of gold and green. She was learning to start her days with beauty instead of other people's emergencies. When she finally looked at her phone, she found 57 missed calls and 83 text messages. The sheer volume suggested something significant had happened. The most recent message was from Riley, "Call me ASAP. Wedding officially cancelled. Jennifer and Bradley had a huge fight last night. It's over." Elizabeth felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for Jennifer's heartbreak, relief that the family drama was over, and a strange sense of vindication. She'd been painted as the villain for not rushing home to fix everything, but maybe some things were meant to break. She called Riley while walking to the lodge's restaurant for breakfast. Finally, Riley answered. "Where have you been? All hell broke loose here last night." "I was sleeping peacefully in the rainforest." "What happened?" "Bradley confronted Jennifer about uninviting you. He told her he knew about you being interested in him first, about her manipulating the situation." Jennifer completely lost it. Elizabeth sat down at her usual table, where Jake was already waiting with coffee and a concerned expression. How did she lose it? Full meltdown. Screaming about how you were trying to ruin her life even from Costa Rica, how you turned her own fiancé against her. She accused Bradley of being in love with you and said the only reason he was questioning the wedding was because you'd poisoned his mind. Elizabeth closed her eyes. Even in Jennifer's moment of crisis, she was making Elizabeth the villain. What did Bradley say? He said he wasn't in love with you, but he was horrified by Jennifer's willingness to exclude her own sister from her wedding. He said if she could be that cruel to family, what would she do to him when they inevitably disagreed about something? Elizabeth could imagine the conversation, Bradley's quiet reasonableness clashing with Jennifer's dramatic self-righteousness. So he called off the wedding? He said he needed time to think. That maybe they should postpone until they could work through their communication issues. Jennifer said if he wasn't ready to marry her right now, he never would be, and she didn't want to wait around for him to decide she was worth it. So Jennifer ended it? Jennifer ended it. In front of both sets of parents and the wedding party. She threw her engagement ring at Bradley and said she was done with men who couldn't appreciate what they had. Elizabeth felt a pang of sympathy for her sister. Jennifer's dramatics aside, heartbreak was painful no matter how it happened. How is she? Devastated. And furious. She's telling everyone this is your fault, that you deliberately sabotaged her relationship because you were jealous. And what is everyone saying? That's the interesting part. I think people are getting tired of Jennifer's victim narrative. When she tried to blame you for her problems, your cousin Jennifer actually defended you. She said excluding you from the wedding was cruel and maybe Jennifer should look at her own behavior instead of blaming everyone else. Elizabeth felt a warmth she hadn't expected. Jennifer had always been Jennifer's ally, the cousin who laughed at Jennifer's jokes and supported her versions of events. Jennifer said that? She said she'd been watching Jennifer treat you badly for years and she was glad you finally stood up for yourself. She said going to Costa Rica instead of begging for forgiveness was the most self-respecting thing you'd ever done. After they hung up, Elizabeth sat in stunned silence. The wedding was over, Jennifer was heartbroken, and somehow Elizabeth was still being blamed for choosing herself over family dysfunction. Jake reached across the table and squeezed her hand. How are you feeling? Free, Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the honesty. I feel terrible for Jennifer's pain, but I also feel free. Like I've been released from a prison I didn't even know I was in. You're not responsible for Jennifer's choices, Jake said gently. You're only responsible for your own. They spent the day hiking to a remote waterfall, the physical exertion helping Elizabeth process the complex emotions swirling inside her. She felt sad about Jennifer's heartbreak, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The wedding that had dominated her family's attention for months was over, and she hadn't had to sacrifice her own well-being to help manage the crisis. At the waterfall, they sat on smooth rocks and watched the water cascade into a clear pool below. Elizabeth thought about cycles, how water evaporated, became clouds, fell as rain, and eventually found its way back to the ocean. Maybe family relationships work the same way, with periods of distance and closeness, conflict and resolution. "I think I'm ready to go home," she said. "Are you sure? You still have 3 days left on your reservation." Elizabeth considered staying longer, extending her escape from family drama. But she was beginning to understand that running away wasn't the same as moving forward. "I'm sure. I came here to remember who I am, and I think I've done that. Now I need to figure out how to be that person back in my real life." That evening she called her parents. Her mother answered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Elizabeth? Thank goodness. We've been so worried about you." "I'm fine, Mom. I heard about the wedding. How's Jennifer?" "She's not well. She's convinced this is all your fault. She says if you'd come home when she needed you, you could have helped her and Bradley work through their problems." Elizabeth felt the familiar pull of guilt, the old instinct to absorb responsibility for Jennifer's pain. But she also felt something new, a clear-eyed understanding that Jennifer's problems weren't hers to solve. Jennifer's relationship with Bradley was between them. My presence or absence wouldn't have changed the fundamental issues they needed to work through. "She's your sister, Elizabeth. She's hurting. I know she's hurting. But she's also 26 years old, and she needs to learn that actions have consequences. She excluded me from her wedding because she was afraid of competition. Now she's dealing with the result of building a relationship on insecurity and manipulation." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You sound different." "I am different. I'm learning to take care of myself instead of constantly managing everyone else's emotions." "Jennifer needs you right now." "Jennifer needs therapy," Elizabeth said gently. "And I need to stop enabling her by always being available to absorb her crises." After they hung up, Elizabeth sat on her balcony and wrote in her journal. Day 6. Jennifer's wedding collapsed under the weight of her own dishonesty and manipulation. "I feel sad for her pain, but I don't feel responsible for fixing it. I'm learning that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. I can love Jennifer and still refuse to participate in her dysfunction. Maybe that's the most loving thing I can do. Refuse to enable her worst impulses and hope she learns to be better." Tomorrow she would start the journey home. But she was bringing a new version of herself back with her, one that didn't automatically shrink to make room for other people's egos. One that knew the difference between helping and enabling, between being needed and being used. The forest outside her window was alive with night sounds, creatures living honestly in the darkness. Elizabeth was learning to do the same. Elizabeth's flight home departed San Jose at dawn, carrying her away from the cloud forest and back toward the complicated reality of family relationships. But as the plane lifted off, she felt different than she had a week ago. The anxious knot in her stomach had been replaced by a quiet confidence, a sense of her own worth that couldn't be shaken by other people's opinions. During the layover in Miami, she turned on her phone and found a voicemail from Jennifer. Against her better judgment, she listened to it. "Elizabeth, I know you probably think you've won or something, but you haven't. You've destroyed my life out of jealousy and everyone knows it. I hope you're happy with yourself because you've lost your sister forever. Don't bother coming to see me when you get back. I never want to see you again." A week ago, that message would have sent Elizabeth into a panic. She would have called Jennifer immediately, apologizing for imagined wrongs and begging for forgiveness. But now she felt a strange detachment, as if Jennifer were a dramatic character in a play rather than her sister. She saved the message and boarded her connecting flight to Denver. Jake had offered to drive her home from the airport, but Elizabeth had declined. She needed to navigate this return to her old life on her own terms, without the protective buffer of new friendship. Her apartment felt smaller than she remembered, cluttered with reminders of her old life. Wedding magazines Jennifer had given her sat on the coffee table. A bridesmaid dress hung in her closet, bought for a wedding she'd never been invited to attend. Elizabeth gathered these artifacts of her former role as Jennifer's supporting actress and put them in a box. She was done being a supporting character in other people's stories. The next morning, Riley came over with coffee and croissants, eager to hear about Costa Rica and the aftermath of the wedding cancellation. "You look amazing," Riley said, studying Elizabeth's face. "Relaxed. Confident. Like you've been sleeping well for the first time in years." "I have been sleeping well. It's amazing how restful life becomes when you stop trying to manage other people's emotions." "So what's your plan? Are you going to call Jennifer?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Eventually. But not to apologize or fix things. When I'm ready, I'll call to set boundaries and see if she's willing to have a healthier relationship. And if she's not? Then I'll be sad about it, but I won't sacrifice my own well-being to maintain a relationship that requires me to be smaller than I am. That afternoon, Elizabeth's father called. Unlike her mother, he sounded more curious than accusatory. "How was your trip, honey?" "Life-changing," Elizabeth said honestly. "I remembered who I am when I'm not constantly trying to fix everyone else's problems." "Your mother's worried about you. She says you've become cold." "I haven't become cold, Dad. I've become boundaried. There's a difference. Jennifer's really struggling. She's barely eating, barely sleeping. She's convinced you hate her." Elizabeth felt a familiar tug of sympathy, but she also felt something new. The ability to feel compassion without taking responsibility. "I don't hate Jennifer. But I also don't hate myself anymore. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own well-being over everyone else's comfort with my dysfunction." "That sounds pretty healthy to me," her father said quietly. Elizabeth was surprised. "Really? Really? I've watched you shrink yourself to accommodate Jennifer's ego for years. Your mother and I enabled it because it was easier than dealing with Jennifer's tantrums. But maybe easier isn't always better." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we did Jennifer a disservice by always having you available to absorb her problems. Maybe if she'd faced consequences for her behavior earlier, she would have learned to be a better person." Elizabeth felt a rush of validation. Her father's words were the first acknowledgement she'd ever received that Jennifer's treatment of her wasn't normal sibling dynamics. "I love Jennifer," Elizabeth said. "But I can't keep enabling her worst impulses and calling it family loyalty." "I understand. And I'm proud of you for choosing yourself for once." After they hung up, Elizabeth sat in her living room thinking about change. She'd expected more resistance to her new boundaries, more guilt about Jennifer's pain. But maybe her family was ready for change too, tired of the exhausting dynamics that had dominated their relationships for years. That evening she called Jake. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "How's the readjustment going?" "Better than expected. I think I'm not the only one who is tired of the old patterns." "That's usually how it works. When one person changes, it gives everyone else permission to change too." They talked for an hour about Costa Rica, about the photos he'd taken, about the strange way that travel could shift your perspective on everything. Elizabeth found herself laughing more easily than she had in months, enjoying conversation that didn't revolve around crisis management. "I have a confession," Jake said toward the end of the call. "I've been thinking about visiting Denver. I have a photography exhibition opportunity there next month." Elizabeth's heart skipped. "Really? Really? Would you be interested in showing me around? I promise not to drag you on any more rainforest adventures." "I might be interested in more adventures," Elizabeth said, surprising herself with her boldness. After they hung up, Elizabeth opened her journal and wrote, "Day 7. Home but not the same. I'm learning that changing yourself changes everything around you. People are responding to my boundaries with more respect than I expected. Even Dad seems relieved that I'm not absorbing Jennifer's dysfunction anymore. Maybe everyone was tired of the old patterns, but no one knew how to break them until I stopped participating. I'm beginning to understand that the most revolutionary act isn't fighting against what you don't want. It's choosing what you do want and living it consistently." Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Elizabeth was learning to navigate by her own light instead of constantly adjusting her course to avoid other people's storms. 3 months after Elizabeth returned from Costa Rica, she sat in a coffee shop downtown, waiting for Jennifer. It was their first face-to-face conversation since the wedding cancellation, and Elizabeth felt calm in a way that would have been impossible before her trip. Jennifer arrived 15 minutes late, looking thinner than Elizabeth remembered, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She slid into the booth across from Elizabeth without making eye contact. "I still can't believe you're making me come to you," Jennifer said. "I'm the one who got left at the altar." "You ended your own engagement," Elizabeth said gently. "And I'm not making you do anything. I suggested we meet if you wanted to talk. You said yes." Jennifer's eyes flashed with familiar anger. "You know what I meant. You disappeared to Costa Rica while my life was falling apart. What kind of sister does that?" Elizabeth took a sip of her coffee, considering her response. 3 months ago, she would have immediately apologized and taken responsibility for Jennifer's pain. Now she felt curious about Jennifer's perspective without feeling obligated to fix it. The kind of sister who was uninvited from your wedding and chose to take care of herself instead of begging for forgiveness for being hurt. "I told you that was about space." Jennifer, we both know that wasn't true. You uninvited me because you were afraid Bradley would realize he was interested in me first. You built your entire relationship on competition with me instead of love for him. Jennifer's face went pale. That's not. I loved Bradley. Maybe you did. But you also manipulated the situation to make sure you won me like a prize. And then you excluded me from your wedding because you were still competing with me instead of celebrating your love. They sat in silence for a moment. Elizabeth could see Jennifer processing this, her sister's face cycling through denial, anger, and something that might have been recognition. Even if that's true, Jennifer said finally, you still abandoned me when I needed you most. I chose myself when you made it clear I wasn't wanted. There's a difference. But I'm your sister. Yes, you are. And I love you. But I don't love the way you've treated me, and I'm not going to enable it anymore by pretending it's normal. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. So what, you're just going to cut me out of your life? I'm going to have a relationship with you that doesn't require me to be smaller than I am. If you want that too, we can work on it together. If you don't, I'll be sad about it, but I won't sacrifice my own well-being to maintain a relationship that hurts me. Jennifer stared into her coffee cup. I've been seeing a therapist. Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. How's that going? Hard. She says I have patterns of competing with people instead of connecting with them. She says I learned to get attention by being better than everyone else, and I never learned how to just be loved for who I am. That makes sense. You were always the golden child. Mom and Dad praised your achievements more than your character. She says I've been treating you like a threat instead of a sister. That I've been so afraid of you outshining me that I've been trying to dim your light instead of learning to shine alongside you. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed Jennifer's hand. I never wanted to compete with you. I just wanted to be your sister. Jennifer started crying then, not the dramatic tears Elizabeth was used to, but quiet, genuine sobs that spoke of real grief and recognition. I'm sorry, Jennifer whispered. I'm so sorry for all of it. For the wedding, for Bradley, for all the ways I've made you feel less than. I don't know how to be different, but I want to try. I'd like that too, Elizabeth said. But it's going to take time. And I'm going to need you to respect my boundaries while we figure it out. What kind of boundaries? I'm not going to be your crisis manager anymore. I'm not going to drop everything to fix your problems or absorb your emotions. I'm going to be your sister, but I'm also going to be my own person with my own life and my own needs. Jennifer nodded, wiping her eyes. I can try. I want to try. They talked for another hour, carefully and honestly in a way they never had before. Jennifer shared what she was learning in therapy about her need for control and competition. Elizabeth shared what she'd discovered about herself in Costa Rica, about the difference between helping and enabling. When they parted ways, Elizabeth felt cautiously optimistic. Change was possible, but it would take time and consistent effort from both of them. That evening Jake called. He'd been visiting Denver regularly since his photography exhibition, and their friendship had deepened into something that felt like the beginning of love. How did it go with Jennifer? He asked. Better than expected. She's starting therapy and seems genuinely interested in changing the patterns between us. That's wonderful. And how are you feeling about it? Hopeful but realistic. I'm not going to rush back into the old dynamics just because she's apologizing. But I'm willing to see if she can learn to be a better sister. That sounds very wise. And very you. Elizabeth smiled. I'm learning who me is. It's been an interesting discovery. I'm enjoying getting to know her too. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood in her new apartment, looking out at the mountains that had become her daily view. She'd used her savings to start a consulting business helping small nonprofits with their finances, work that felt meaningful in a way her corporate job never had. Jennifer had continued therapy and was slowly learning to have a relationship with Elizabeth that didn't revolve around competition. They had dinner once a month, carefully rebuilding trust and learning to enjoy each other's company. Bradley had reached out to Elizabeth a few weeks after the wedding cancellation, not to pursue a relationship but to apologize for his role in the family drama. He was dating someone new, a kindergarten teacher who seemed to appreciate his quiet nature without requiring him to manage her emotional storms. Jake had moved to Denver permanently, his nature photography business thriving in Colorado's outdoor culture. They'd been dating for 4 months, and Elizabeth was learning what it felt like to be with someone who valued her thoughts and enjoyed her company without needing her to be smaller to make room for his ego. On this particular evening, Elizabeth was hosting a dinner party, something she'd never done before Costa Rica. Riley was there, along with Jake, a few colleagues from her new business, and surprisingly Jennifer. Elizabeth watched her sister laugh at one of Jake's stories about photographing bears in Yellowstone, and felt a cautious happiness. Jennifer was learning to be genuinely interested in other people's experiences instead of always redirecting conversations back to herself. "I'm proud of you," Riley said, joining Elizabeth in the kitchen as she prepared dessert. "You've built a whole new life." "I've built my own life for the first time," Elizabeth corrected. "I never realized how much energy I was spending managing other people's emotions instead of living my own experiences."